All right, let's ditch those dusty old history books and dive headfirst into Romanticism. We're going way beyond those cliches about flowing shirts and moonlit poetry readings today.
It really is fascinating how Romanticism was this huge cultural shift, like an earthquake shaking up art and literature and how people thought, really everything.
So picture this, a world obsessed with logic and reason. Got it. Now imagine a sudden wave of emotion, this deep connection with nature and a fascination with the past. That's Romanticism in a nutshell.
And get this, the source material we have here, a literary study focusing on British Romanticism, describes the era as unreasonable, agitated, even loving solitude.
Those aren't exactly words you put on a travel brochure, are they?
Maybe not. But they perfectly capture the spirit of this movement. It was all about pushing back against the Enlightenment, that whole logic and order thing. Romanticism was about embracing feeling and intuition.
So it wasn't just a change in artistic style, it was a whole different way of looking at the world.
Exactly. The Enlightenment was about controlling nature, using reason to solve every problem. Romanticism was about connecting with nature, feeling those deep emotions, and accepting that some things are just mysteries.
I have a feeling this is going to be a wild ride. Our source mentions Jean-Jacques Rousseau as this major influence on the Romantics. Didn't he kind of trash everything about 18th century thought?
Oh, he did. Rousseau was convinced that society was corrupting humanity. He thought we needed to get back to a more natural way of being. He was really critical of the Enlightenment's obsession with reason. He argued that feelings and intuition are just as important.
And Rousseau was known for being pretty intense, right? Yeah. He struggled with his mental health, too. Do you think that intensity, that unbalanced side of him, is part of what makes Romanticism so captivating?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, Romanticism definitely wasn't about being perfectly balanced or hiding your feelings, was it? It was about embracing everything about being human, even the messy, chaotic parts.
It makes sense that a movement all about intense feelings would be influenced by someone who, well, felt things intensely.
You got it. Rousseau's life and his personality were all wrapped up in the same themes he wrote about. Those themes went on to become central to the whole Romantic movement.
It's amazing how these big ideas can shape a whole cultural movement. Now, before we get too carried away with poets wandering through fields of wildflowers, I have to bring up something our source points out. Not everyone was on board with this whole Romanticism thing.
Right. Figures like the Prince Regent and the Duke of Wellington, they were all about the Enlightenment. They were much more interested in power and order than exploring their feelings or hanging out in nature.
So it wasn't just personal preference. It was like two totally different ways of understanding the world. The artists and writers were all about Romanticism, but the political and social elite were still holding on to those Enlightenment ideals.
Exactly. It's a big deal because it shows that literature wasn't just reflecting the dominant thoughts and feelings of the time anymore. It became this space for different perspectives, for challenging the status quo. It was a haven for people who felt alienated by the values of their society.
That is a huge shift. And speaking of challenging the status quo, let's zoom out for a second and look at what was happening politically during this period. I mean, wow, it was a crazy time. Napoleon was on the rise and then fell. The Congress of Vienna was trying to put Europe back together after the French Revolution. And over in England, there was so much social unrest brewing.
You're not kidding. It was a time of massive change. And remember, the Romantics were all about individual liberty and expressing yourself. It makes sense that many of them saw the French Revolution as a win for their ideals.
Ah, yes, the allure of revolution. It always seems so romantic at first, doesn't it? But then reality hits and it all gets very complicated.
You said it. Napoleon went from being a hero of the revolution to being an emperor, which wasn't exactly very romantic, was it? A lot of romantics felt like the revolution had abandoned its own principles.
So this disillusionment became a recurring theme in their work.
It pops up everywhere. Think of the poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge. They started out as revolutionaries, then their views shifted and became more conservative.
Maybe they just got tired of all the drama. Revolutions can be exhausting.
Maybe. But the political landscape wasn't just background noise for them. The Romantics really engaged with politics, both in their writing and their lives.
Speaking of engaging with politics, were all the Romantic writers on the same page? Or were there some pretty different opinions within the movement?
Oh, definitely a range of views. Romanticism wasn't one big monolithic block. Remember Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey? They started out fiery but became more conservative.
Right. They represent the disillusioned idealists, the ones who got their hopes crushed by how revolution actually worked. Who else was in this Romantic crew?
Well, on the other end of the spectrum, you had William Hazlitt. He was a critic and essayist, a hardcore anti-Tory. He never gave up his radical beliefs, not one bit. He fought for individual liberty and spoke out against the government and the ruling class.
He sounds like the ultimate rebel.
Mm.
What did he think about the other romantics who became more conservative?
He thought they totally sold out. He felt like they abandoned the fight for social justice. He was especially tough on Wordsworth, saying he'd retreated into nature and ignored the real problems of the world.
So for Hazlitt, Romanticism wasn't just about pretty poems and nature walks. It was about taking action, making real change in the world.
Exactly. He was convinced that art and literature should be used to fight injustice, to inspire people to rise up and demand a better world. He saw how powerful words could be.
And speaking of passionate revolutionaries, we can't forget Byron and Shelley. They were like the rock stars of the Romantic movement, known for their scandalous lives and their radical politics. Where did they fit into all of this?
They were the ultimate rebels. Byron, with his larger-than-life personality and his fight for Greek independence, was a global celebrity. And Shelley, with his atheism and his utopian dreams, was considered way too radical, even by some other romantics.
They both sound like they were full of contradictions, embracing individualism while wanting huge social change. How did that play out in their poetry?
Well, that's something we'll explore more deeply later. But to give you a taste, both Byron and Shelley saw poetry as a weapon against injustice, as a tool to transform society. Their writing is overflowing with passion and outrage, this deep longing for a better world.
It sounds like they were really pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be a romantic in both their lives and their art. Now, I can't imagine the conservative literary world was too thrilled about these romantic rebels and their radical ideas. Was there any, clash between the two?
Oh, huge clash. Conservative critics, like the ones writing for the Quarterly Review, were horrified by how the Romantics rejected tradition, the way they embraced emotion and imagination and individual expression, totally shocking to them.
It was more than just a difference in taste, right? It was this huge battle over what literature should be, a struggle for power.
You got it. Conservative critics saw the Romantics as this threat to the whole establishment. Like, they were spreading dangerous ideas that could destabilize everything. They attacked them viciously, called them vulgar and immoral, accused them of being subversive.
It's amazing how art and literature become battlegrounds for these bigger cultural and political fights. It makes you think how much amazing art we've lost over the years because of those kinds of power struggles. Do we have any specific examples of these attacks on the Romantics?
Oh, definitely. Take John Keats, for example. He was absolutely savaged by the conservative critics. They went after his poetry, his background, his whole life, everything. They said he was talentless, an upstart who dared to challenge the literary elite.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Just for writing poems. It's not like he was leading some kind of armed rebellion or anything.
Well, to them, anything that challenged traditional values was seen as dangerous. The Romantics, with their focus on self-expression and their critiques of society, they were shaking things up, and the establishment didn't like it one bit.
Sounds like the critics were just threatened by how talented and original Keats was. And tragically, those attacks might have contributed to his failing health and his early death. It's a stark reminder that words have real power. They can have huge consequences.
It really makes you think. It reminds us how important critical thinking is, questioning what you hear and seeing how power dynamics shape everything, even how art is received and talked about.
Okay, before we get too bogged down in all the negativity, let's switch gears. The Romantics were obsessed with the past, weren't they? Especially the Middle Ages. Why was that? Were they just big history nerds?
It was more than just a fascination with history. It was this longing for a simpler time, a time that felt more authentic, more in tune with nature and human emotion. Our source puts it beautifully. What they wanted to explore was their own inner world of dream and desire, to separate this inner world from the ordinary outer world.
It sounds like they were trying to escape from the reality of their world, all the stress and anxieties of industrialization and constant change.
You got it. They weren't really concerned with getting the history right. They were more interested in using the past to fuel their creativity, to explore their own inner landscapes and feelings.
So they created this space where emotions could run free, where their imaginations could take over. It was their creative sanctuary, a place to escape from the pressures of the modern world.
That's a lovely way to put it. And each writer had their own way of escaping. Some dove headfirst into those medieval landscapes, some went deep into Greek mythology, others went searching for inspiration in far-off places like the Near East.
They were each creating their own fantasy worlds, taking bits and pieces of the past and using them to make something new and exciting. And it wasn't just about running away from reality, right? It was about using the past as a way to understand the complexities of human experience.
Exactly. They weren't just hiding from the present, they were trying to make sense of it, to find meaning and beauty in a world that felt confusing and overwhelming.
This idea of finding meaning and beauty in unexpected places takes us to William Wordsworth, the king of nature lovers. We've already touched on how much he loved the natural world, but how did he see nature differently from other romantics?
Wordsworth had this intensely personal and spiritual connection to nature. Other romantics looked for escape in fantasy worlds or faraway places. Wordsworth found everything he needed in the beauty of the natural world around him, especially in his beloved Lake District.
So for him, it wasn't about escaping reality at all. It was about finding this deeper reality within nature itself.
Exactly. Wordsworth was convinced that nature held deep truths. He saw it as a guide for morality, a source of spiritual renewal, and the spark for his creativity. He didn't need to create imaginary worlds or travel to faraway places. He found everything he needed in the lakes, mountains, and forests of his home.
He was like the original nature influencer, telling everyone to ditch their screens and get outside. But it was more than just pretty scenery for him, right? There was something much deeper going on.
Oh, absolutely. He truly believed that nature could teach us how to live, about ourselves, about our place in the universe. He saw nature as a teacher, a healer, and a mirror reflecting the deepest truths about being human.
You know, that reminds me of a line from Tintern Abbey where he talks about feeling the burden of the mystery of the world. What do you think he was wrestling with in that poem? What was this mystery all about?
It sounds like he was struggling with the big questions, like what's the meaning of life? What's our connection to nature? What are the limits of what we can understand? He felt this awe and wonder when he looked at the natural world, but also this unease, like there were secrets we'd never figure out.
So he wasn't just writing pretty poems about flowers and trees. He was trying to solve the riddles of existence, figure out where we fit in the grand scheme of things. He was on a spiritual quest, using poetry as his map.
I think that's a great way to put it. He believed that poetry could give you this whole new way of experiencing nature, one that went beyond logic and reason. He wanted to capture the very essence of nature, its beauty, its power, its mystery, and then give that to his readers.
It sounds like he was trying to shake people out of their normal way of seeing the world, wake up their senses, and get them to connect with nature on a deeper level.
That's exactly it. He wanted people to see nature as this living force that's connected to our lives, not just a bunch of objects to look at and categorize.
And that belief came from his own personal journey, right?
Yeah.
Our source talks about how he got disillusioned with the French Revolution and turned to his childhood memories and simplicity of nature. Was he trying to get back something he felt like he'd lost?
I think so. Wordsworth's life had these periods of huge idealism, but also these really deep disappointments. He was so excited about the French Revolution at first, but then he saw the violence and the chaos, and he felt betrayed. It's like he was searching for something solid, something lasting, amidst all the upheaval and loss. Did this search shape his idea of growth, which our source highlights as so important in his poetry?
That's a great question. Tell me more about Wordsworth's concept of growth.
Wordsworth saw the natural world as this model for how humans develop, like how a plant grows from a seed to a flower. He believed that if we really immersed ourselves in nature, observed its cycles and rhythms, we could learn valuable lessons about how to grow, adapt, and find meaning in a world that's constantly changing. He believed that true growth could only happen in relationship with others and with the natural world. He was critical of the individualism and self-absorption that he saw as rampant in modern society. He thought we need to reconnect with our communities, with nature, and with a sense of shared humanity if we want to truly flourish.
That message feels so relevant today when so many of us feel isolated and disconnected. Wordsworth is reminding us that we need each other and that we need to find ways to connect with something larger than ourselves to find real meaning and purpose.
I totally agree. Wordsworth's poetry is like this roadmap for navigating the complexities of modern life, a reminder that the answers to our biggest questions might be found not in achievements or possessions, but in cultivating a deeper connection with ourselves, with nature, and with the people around us.
Okay, before we jump into some specific examples of Wordsworth poetry, can you give us the SparkNotes version of his biography? What shaped him into the poet he became?
Wordsworth's life was full of both joy and sorrow, love and loss, triumph and disappointment. He was born in this stunningly beautiful place, the Lake District of England. It's no surprise that those landscapes became his lifelong inspiration.
Ah, the Lake District. Rugged mountains, sparkling lakes. misty moors. It's like the romantic poet starter kit.
Right. The Lake District is just breathtaking. Wordsworth spent his childhood wandering those hills and valleys. It's no wonder it had such a huge impact on him.
It sounds idyllic. But his childhood wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it?
Sadly, no. He lost both his parents when he was young. His mother died when he was only 8, and his father passed away 5 years later.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. That must have been so hard for him. Did those early losses influence his poetry?
Absolutely. Loss and grief, the search for comfort and connection, those themes run through all of his work. He turned to nature for comfort, especially when things were tough. He found peace in the beauty and permanence of nature, especially when human life felt so fragile and uncertain.
It's amazing how nature can provide that sense of peace,
Yeah.
especially when everything else feels like it's falling apart. So what happened to young William after he lost both of his parents?
Well, after his father died, he and his siblings were split up and sent to live with different relatives. Being separated from his family was really painful for him, and I think it made that longing for connection and belonging even stronger.
That's so sad. It makes sense why family and connection are such important themes in his work. So when did he figure out he loved poetry? Was he one of those kids who was writing sonnets in his diaper?
I don't know about sonnets and diapers, but he was definitely a gifted storyteller from a young age. It wasn't until he went to Cambridge, though, that he truly fell in love with poetry.
Ah, Cambridge. Such a breeding ground for brilliant writers. What was it about Cambridge that sparked his passion for poetry?
It exposed him to a much wider world of literature and philosophy and political ideas. He was really inspired by the Romantic poets of the generation before him, people like William Blake and Robert Burns. They were breaking all the rules of traditional poetry and exploring new ways of expressing themselves.
He was inspired by the rebels, by the poets who were forging their own paths.
Exactly. He started experimenting with his own writing, trying out new forms and styles, and finding his own unique voice. And then, of course, there was the French Revolution, which, as we talked about earlier, had a huge impact on him.
Ah, yes, the French Revolution. It was a turning point for so many of the Romantics, wasn't it? It fired up their idealism and really shaped their lives and their work. Tell me more about how the revolution affected Wordsworth.
Well, as a young man, Wordsworth was so moved by the ideals of the revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. He saw it as a chance for humanity to create a better world, a world free from tyranny and oppression.
It's hard to imagine the excitement and optimism that must have swept through Europe during those early days of the revolution. It must have felt like anything was possible.
It did. And Wordsworth was right there in the middle of it. He even traveled to France and spent a year there, immersing himself in the whole revolutionary atmosphere. He even fell head over heels in love with a French woman named Annette Vallant.
Ooh la la.
Yeah.
A cross-cultural romance. So what happened? Did they run off together to build their own little revolutionary love nest?
I wish. Unfortunately, war broke out between France and England, and Wordsworth had to go back home. He had to leave Annette and their newborn daughter behind.
Wow, talk about a Romeo and Juliet situation, but with political turmoil thrown in.
Yeah.
So he's heartbroken, separated from the woman he loves and his child, and disillusioned with the revolution he once believed in. What does he do?
He retreats to the one place that's always been there for him: nature. He goes back to the Lake District with his sister Dorothy, who becomes his best friend and his creative partner. It's around this time that he meets Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another incredible writer. They become close friends, and it shapes both of their careers.
It's like the Romantic Avengers are assembling, two of the greatest minds of their generation joining forces to change the world of literature forever. What was it about their collaboration that made it so special?
They were kindred spirits, both deeply interested in the power of imagination, the beauty of nature, and all the complexities of human experience. They pushed each other, they inspired each other, and they helped each other create their best work.
It's amazing how creative collaborations can be so powerful. Sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in you and challenge you to reach your full potential.
Exactly. And for Wordsworth and Coleridge, that collaboration led to Lyrical Ballads, one of the most important works in English literature.
Lyrical Ballads, the book that launched 1,000 romantic poems. Tell me more about this literary bombshell.
Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798. It was this collection of poems that completely broke the mold, totally different from the poetic conventions of the time. It included some of Wordsworth's most famous poems, like Tintern Abbey, as well as Coleridge's masterpiece, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
That's a pretty impressive lineup. What was so revolutionary about Lyrical Ballads? What made it such a big deal?
Well, Wordsworth and Coleridge were intentionally shaking things up. They were convinced that poetry should be accessible to everyone, not just the elite. They wrote in simple language, focusing on the lives of everyday people.
They were democratizing poetry, making it relevant to the average Joe.
Exactly, and they really emphasized the power of emotion and imagination in poetry. They argued that poetry should make you feel something, move you, not just impress you with its cleverness.
They were tapping into something universal about being human, something that people connected with on a deep level.
Absolutely. And that's why Lyrical Ballads is considered such a turning point in English literature. It's the beginning of the Romantic movement as we know it.
Okay, we've talked a lot about Wordsworth's life, his ideas, and his collaborations. But let's get to the heart of it all, the poems themselves. What are some of his most iconic works, the ones that really capture his essence?
Tintern Abbey is often considered his masterpiece. It's a long, intricate poem that explores all these big themes: memory, time, nature, the search for meaning.
That's definitely one to add to the reading list. But for those who might be new to Wordsworth, what are some of his shorter, more accessible poems? Where should they start?
Lines Written in Early Spring is a beautiful place to start. It's this lyrical, thoughtful poem where he reflects on the beauty of nature and how sad it is that we're so disconnected from it. It's a classic example of Wordsworth finding joy in simple things while also feeling the sadness about how we mess up the harmony of nature.
It's like he's saying, look at this amazing planet. Why do we have to keep messing it up?
Yeah.
A message that feels pretty relevant today, don't you think?
More relevant than ever. Wordsworth was writing over 200 years ago, but his worries about what we're doing to nature are even more urgent today. He was ahead of his time in that way.
So true. What other Wordsworth gems should we check out?
The Tables Turned is another great one. He's basically telling his friend to ditch the books and go out and experience nature.
I can practically hear him saying, put down that phone and go for a walk.
Exactly. He believed that we could learn so much more from being in nature than we could ever learn from a textbook. Just by observing the natural world, listening to the birds sing, watching the clouds go by.
I feel that. I often have my most creative moments when I'm out in nature, away from all the distractions.
It's like nature clears all the clutter from our minds, helps us see things more clearly. It connects us to something bigger than ourselves.
Okay, what other Wordsworth poems should we add to our list?
Well, if you want to see Wordsworth's social and political side, you have to read London, 1802. It's this powerful sonnet where he's super disappointed with the state of English society. He's calling on the spirit of John Milton, this great poet from the past, to help revive the nation's values.
That feeling of longing for a simpler, better past, that's classic Romanticism. It feels like every generation gets nostalgic for a time they never actually lived through, a time that somehow seems pure or more meaningful.
It's so true. It's like this basic human impulse. We're always looking for something better, something that feels lost. And for Wordsworth, that something was a feeling of community, a connection to nature, and a commitment to higher ideals, things he felt were missing in the modern world.
And the way he contrasts the busy, materialistic city of London with the peace and beauty of the Lake District. It's like he's saying, we've lost our way. We need to get back to basics, back to what really matters.
Exactly. And this feeling of being disillusioned with modern life is even stronger in his poem, The World is Too Much with Us, where he critiques how materialistic and spiritually empty society has become. There's this famous line where he says he'd rather be a pagan worshiping ancient gods than be caught up in the rat race for wealth and possessions.
It's kind of scary how relevant that feels to us today. We're still stuck in that whole work, buy stuff, repeat cycle. It's like we're running on a treadmill, always chasing after more, but never really finding what we're looking for.
It's this age-old human struggle. How do we find meaning when the world feels so chaotic and overwhelming? Wordsworth's poetry reminds us to slow down, reconnect with nature, and rediscover a sense of awe and wonder.
I think you've given our listeners a great starting point for exploring Wordsworth's work. His poems offer this timeless message about the importance of nature, finding meaning in simple things, and cultivating a sense of wonder in a world that can feel pretty bleak sometimes.
I agree. And while we've learned a lot today, there's always more to discover. I encourage everyone to dive into his work and see what speaks to them.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time with Wordsworth. Let's move on to another giant of the Romantic era, John Keats. What makes him stand out from the crowd?
Oh, John Keats. Where to even begin? He was this young, passionate poet who died way too young at only 26. But he left behind this incredible body of work. What makes Keats particularly interesting is that he faced a challenge that was unique to his generation. You see, the poet could no longer speak for society as a whole.
What do you mean by that? Weren't poets always kind of outsiders expressing their own individual views?
You're right, but something had shifted in the Romantic era. Our source compares Keats to Milton to illustrate this point. Milton, writing in the 17th century, could still assume that his poetry would reflect the beliefs and values of his society. But by Keats's time, that shared cultural unity had broken down.
So Keats was dealing with this feeling of isolation. Like he was a poet in a world that didn't really have a place for poetry anymore.
Exactly. He was trying to figure out what it meant to be a poet in a world that was rapidly changing, a world where the old rules didn't apply anymore. He admired Wordsworth, but he knew he couldn't just copy him. Keats had to forge his own path, find his own voice.
And this struggle to find his identity played out in his poetry, didn't it? How did his personal journey shape his artistic vision?
Keats's life is as fascinating as his poetry. He came from humble beginnings. He lost both of his parents when he was young and always struggled financially.
Like life just kept throwing him curveballs.
It did, and then just when he started getting recognition for his work, he got sick with tuberculosis, the same disease that killed his mother and brother. Talk about a heavy burden to carry.
It's hard to imagine being able to create anything beautiful when you're facing that much adversity. But Keats kept going, didn't he?
He did. And despite all the hardship he went through, his poetry is filled with a sense of beauty and wonder, this deep appreciation for the world and all its sensory experiences. He was acutely aware of how fragile life is, how precious every moment is.
Okay, so we've got the tragic backstory. Now let's talk about what made Keats's poetry so unique. What set him apart?
One word: sensuousness. Keats was a master of using words to create vivid images and evoke sensations. He wanted his readers to feel like they were experiencing everything alongside him. The coolness of a dewdrop, the sweetness of a nightingale song, the weight of sorrow, the thrill of love.
That's a tall order, making words do that much heavy lifting. Did he have any special techniques?
He was brilliant at using imagery and metaphors. He'd use really concrete sensory details to paint these vivid pictures in the reader's mind. He wasn't afraid to play with language, to push the boundaries of what words could do.
He sounds like he was a bit of a rebel, even within the Romantic movement.
Absolutely. He challenged the conventions of the time, arguing for a more direct, more sensual, more emotionally charged style of writing. He didn't shy away from difficult emotions. He embraced them, explored them, and made them feel real through his words.
And that intensity, that rawness, is part of what makes his poetry so powerful, even centuries later. It feels real, relatable, like he's speaking directly to us.
You're right. He was writing about universal human experiences. Love, loss, longing, the search for meaning and beauty in a world that often feels indifferent.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Keats's style and themes, but what about his impact on literature as a whole? What was his legacy?
Despite his short life, Keats had a huge influence on the poets who came after him. His focus on sensuous language, his exploration of complex emotions, and his experimental use of form paved the way for the modernist poets of the 20th century, like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound.
So he was this bridge between the Romanticism of the early 1800s and the modernism of the 1900s.
Exactly. He took that romantic idea of expressing your emotions and made it even more intense, more complex, and more experimental.
Pretty impressive for someone who died so young. Makes you wonder what he could have achieved if he lived longer.
It does, doesn't it? But even in his short time, he created a body of work that still inspires and challenges people today. His poems remind us of the power of art to transcend time, to connect us to the deepest parts of human experience.
What a beautiful way to put it. Okay, I think we've spent enough time with Keats for now, but I don't want us to forget about those amazing excerpts from that literary study on British Romanticism. There's still so much to explore.
You're right. We've only just dipped our toes into this fascinating period. Let's go back to those excerpts and see what other treasures we can unearth.
Sounds like a plan. I'm ready for more. So our source makes this bold statement. Outside of literature, the age itself wasn't really all that romantic. It specifically names some big names, like the Prince Regent, Prime Minister William Pitt, and the Duke of Wellington as examples.
Right, and that's important to remember. Romanticism was influential, but it wasn't everywhere. The study emphasizes that those powerful figures were not swept up by the Romantic movement. They were focused on the practical, the powerful, the everyday realities of governing.
So while the artists and writers were off exploring emotions in nature, the people in charge were more concerned with keeping everything running smoothly.
Exactly. It shows that Romanticism, as powerful as it was mostly happening within a specific group of people. It thrived among artists, writers, and intellectuals, but it wasn't necessarily influencing every aspect of life.
That's so interesting. These parallel worlds existing side by side. It's like two different conversations happening at the same time, each with its own values and priorities.
It's true. The study goes on to say that this separation actually marked this huge shift in the relationship between literature and society. In the past, literature often reflected what the ruling class was thinking and feeling. But the Romantic Age, this was different.
That's a huge distinction. So, if the most famous writers of the time weren't reflecting the values of the people in power, what does that say about the role of literature in the Romantic era?
It tells us that literature was becoming a space for challenging authority, for expressing views that were different from the mainstream. The Romantics were creating their own counterculture in a way. They were saying, we value imagination, we value emotion, we value individual expression. They were pushing back against the emphasis on reason, order, and conformity.
It makes you wonder if the Romantics felt like outsiders, like the people in charge weren't listening to them. Maybe that's why they turned to nature, to the past, to their own imaginations for inspiration.
That's a great point. Maybe that feeling of being alienated from the dominant culture is what drove them to explore those alternative realms of experience.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Our source then takes us to the political landscape of this period, reminding us that the early 1800s was a time of huge upheaval in Europe.
Oh, definitely. Revolutions, wars, big social changes. It was a wild time. The study specifically talks about the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was both a symbol of the potential for change and the dangers of it.
Napoleon, the ultimate romantic hero. Or was he? He had that drive, that ambition, but wasn't he also kind of a tyrant?
He's a complicated figure, a product of the French Revolution who ended up betraying its ideals by making himself emperor. A lot of romantics initially saw him as a liberator, someone who would spread the ideals of the revolution across Europe. It's so easy to get swept up in that revolutionary excitement, that idea of throwing out the old and creating a new, more just society.
It really is.
Right.
But as we saw with the French Revolution, things don't always go as planned. And Napoleon, his ambition took over, and he ended up becoming the very thing he'd opposed, a dictator.
You're exactly right. So how did the Romantics react to Napoleon's rise to power? Did they feel betrayed?
That's a good question. What did they think?
Many of them did feel betrayed. The study talks about the Whigs in Britain, who were generally sympathetic to the ideals of the French Revolution, initially supported Napoleon. They saw him as someone who might help them in their fight against tyranny and oppression.
Okay, so the Whigs were like the progressives of their day, the ones pushing for change and reform. Who were the Tories?
The Tories were the conservatives. They wanted to stick with the traditional social and political order. They saw Napoleon as a dangerous threat to the British monarchy, someone who could upset the balance of power.
Interesting how these political divides often reflect the tensions we see in art and literature. The Romantics, challenging the status quo with their writing, were often aligned with those Whigs who were pushing for reform.
That's a great connection to make. And the study goes on to say that the Tories, who recognized how dangerous Napoleon was, used propaganda to turn the British public against him. They painted him as this power-hungry dictator who wanted to conquer the world, and it worked.
A battle for hearts and minds. A propaganda war waged through speeches, pamphlets, even poetry. It feels very familiar, doesn't it?
It really does. And in the end, the Tories won. Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and things went back to the old ways, at least for a while. But the seeds of change had been planted, and Europe would never be quite the same.
So even in defeat, Napoleon's impact was huge. He shook things up, challenged the old ways, inspired generations of revolutionaries. Pretty impressive for a guy who started as a nobody.
He really was a force of nature, a larger-than-life figure. He embodied both the triumphs and the tragedies of that revolutionary era.
So, with Napoleon out of the picture, what happened next?
Well, after Napoleon's defeat, all the victors got together at this big meeting called the Congress of Vienna to try and put Europe back together. They wanted to go back to the way things were before, erase all the changes the French Revolution had caused, and reestablish all the old monarchies.
It's like they wanted to pretend the last 25 years never happened. Good luck with that.
You're telling me. Revolutions change everything, don't they? And no matter how hard they tried, the Congress of Vienna couldn't totally erase the impact of the French Revolution.
It's like trying to squeeze toothpaste back into the tube. Once it's out, there's no going back.
So what was happening in England during all of this? Were they dealing with their own unrest while the rest of Europe was busy redrawing borders and consolidating power? Oh, absolutely. The study points out that while the British government was focused on international affairs, Things were getting pretty tense at home. There were uprisings by workers who were fed up with terrible working conditions and unfair wages. The army ended up putting those uprisings down pretty brutally.
So while the elites were celebrating victory abroad, the working class was struggling just to survive.
Exactly. The study paints this stark picture of inequality in British society. A tiny handful of wealthy people lived in luxury, while the vast majority struggled just to get by.
It's a good reminder that historical progress isn't always smooth or peaceful. Often, it's a chaotic mess, a struggle between the people holding on to the old ways and the ones pushing for something new.
You're right about that. And this tension between tradition and progress, between the people who benefited from the status quo and the ones who wanted to change it, played out everywhere in Britain, from politics to art to literature.
So, Europe was rearranging the furniture, so to speak, while England was dealing with its own internal drama, with industrialization, social inequality, and all those calls for political reform.
Exactly. And understanding that context is crucial for really understanding the Romantics in their work. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Byron, Shelley, they were all living through this massive upheaval, and their writing reflects the hopes and fears and anxieties of their time.
They were holding up a mirror to society, showing both the beauty and the ugliness, the successes and failures.
That's a great image. They didn't shy away from the tough stuff. They questioned authority, challenged conventions, and imagined a better future.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into how the Romantics responded to this politically charged environment. Did they all agree politically, or were there different perspectives within the movement?
There was definitely a whole spectrum of opinions, just like you'd expect with any group of artists and thinkers. The study explains that some of the older Romantic poets, like Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Selby, started out as enthusiastic supporters of the French Revolution.
Right, we talked about that earlier. They were all about liberty, equality, fraternity, at least until things went south.
Exactly. They were young and idealistic. They really believed that the revolution could create a more just world. They saw it as a victory for humanity, a triumph over oppression.
It's interesting how their early work is so full of hope and optimism. It's almost utopian, isn't it? But then, as the revolution becomes more violent and chaotic, their tone changes. They become disillusioned, more skeptical, more aware of how complicated human nature really is.
That's such a human experience, isn't it? We start out with these grand visions, these dreams of a perfect world. But then life happens and we have to face reality, acknowledge the darkness and the limits of our understanding.
It's like they were forced to grow up, to let go of their youthful idealism and face the world as it really is, with all its messiness and contradictions.
Exactly. And you see that disillusionment reflected in their later work. It becomes more introspective, more melancholy, more focused on finding meaning and comfort in a world that often feels unpredictable and confusing.
So, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Sally represent those disillusioned idealists, the ones who were let down by the realities of revolution. But not all the Romantics went down that path, right?
That's right. The study talks about William Hazlitt, a well-known critic and essayist of the time, as someone who never wavered in his commitment to social justice. He was a radical, an anti-Tory, who always fought for liberty.
So he was the rebel who never gave up, the one who kept the flame of revolution burning bright.
Yes. Hazlitt was a fierce critic of the government, the monarchy, and the aristocracy. He believed in the power of the people, and he never stopped fighting for social and political reform.
He sounds like a fascinating guy. What were his criticisms of the other Romantics, particularly those who became more conservative?
Hazlitt felt they had abandoned their principles, turned their backs on the fight for social justice, and even sided with the very people they'd once opposed. He was especially critical of Wordsworth, who he felt had withdrawn into a world of nature and personal reflection, ignoring the real-world problems that needed attention.
So for Hazlitt, Romanticism wasn't just about pretty poems and appreciating nature. It was about taking action, making the world a better place.
Exactly. He believed that art and literature should be used to fight injustice, to inspire people to rise up and demand change. He really believed in the power of words to make a difference.
It sounds like he put his ideals into practice. It's inspiring to see someone so dedicated to their beliefs, even when those beliefs were unpopular.
He was definitely a man of conviction, and his writing continues to inspire people who believe that art can change the world.
So we've talked about the older generation of Romantics. What about the younger generation? Did they inherit that political passion?
Absolutely. The study mentions Lord Byron, who was this international celebrity and champion of liberty, and Percy Bysshe Shelley, a true revolutionary who believed in anarchism.
Byron and Shelley. Now we're talking about some serious romantic rebels. They were famous for their wild lives, their radical politics, and their intensely emotional poetry. Did their personal lives affect their writing?
Their lives and their art were totally intertwined. Byron, with his flamboyant personality, his love affairs, and his exile from England, became this symbol of romantic individualism and rebellion. Shelley, with his atheism, his vegetarianism, and his belief in free love, was considered too radical even for some of his fellow romantics.
It sounds like they were walking contradictions, embracing both individualism and social change. How did that play out in their poetry?
Both Byron and Shelley used their poetry to explore themes of freedom, justice, and fighting against oppression. Byron's work is full of passion, drama, and this longing for a world without the constraints of tradition. Shelley's poetry is more philosophical, more focused on his utopian vision, and often calls for a revolution.
So Byron was the rock star, the brooding rebel, and Shelley was the visionary philosopher, the radical dreamer.
That's a great way to put it. They were both brilliant poets who used their art to challenge the status quo and inspire others to fight for a better world.
It's always inspiring to see artists using their voices to fight for what they believe in, to challenge injustice, and inspire others to act.
I agree. Their courage reminds us that art can be a powerful tool for change.
Speaking of artists being targeted for their beliefs, how about John Keats? Was he as politically outspoken as Byron and Shelley?
Keats was a bit different. He was definitely affected by the political climate of his time, but his poetry wasn't explicitly political in the same way that Byron's or Shelley's was. He was more interested in exploring themes of beauty, imagination, and the human experience.
So he was more focused on the inner world, on individual experience rather than on big political schemes or social movements.
Exactly. But even though his poetry wasn't overtly political, he still became a target of those conservative critics.
Why? If Keats was focused on beauty and aesthetics, why would conservative critics attack him? It's not like he was calling for the overthrow of the government or anything.
That's true. But like we talked about earlier, the Romantics represented a challenge to the establishment, both artistically and ideologically. Remember the Quarterly Review? That was the voice of Tory literary opinion, and they were vicious in their attacks on Keats.
So was it more like guilt by association? He was targeted because he was lumped in with the other romantics who were seen as a threat?
I think that was part of it. But there were other reasons they went after Keats. The critics saw him as part of this group called the Cockney School of Poetry, which was made up of working-class poets who were challenging the traditional power structures of the literary world.
So they saw him as an upstart, a threat to the establishment, not just because of his ideas, but because of his background.
Exactly. The conservative critics wanted to maintain their power, and they saw Keats and his fellow Cockney School poets as a threat to that power.
It's a good reminder that even something like poetry can become a battleground in these larger cultural and political wars.
It's true. And the attacks on Keats were incredibly cruel and personal. They mocked his poetry, his background, everything. They said he was talentless, uneducated, unfit to be a poet.
Wow, that's awful. It's hard to believe people could be so cruel to someone as talented as Keats just for writing poetry. Do you think those attacks hurt his career?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely possible. Keats was a sensitive person, and all that negativity must have affected him.
It's so sad to think that his genius might have been stifled by those critics. It's a reminder that words have power. They can inspire, but they can also destroy.
That's a powerful reminder. It also shows us the importance of critical thinking, of questioning what you're told, and recognizing how power dynamics shape everything, even the way we see art.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another really interesting aspect of Romanticism. Their obsession with the past. Why were they so drawn to bygone eras, particularly the Middle Ages? Were they just history buffs?
It was much more than that. It was this longing for a simpler time, a time that felt more authentic, more connected to nature and human emotions.
So they were looking to the past for meaning and inspiration, maybe as a way to escape the complexities and stresses of their own time.
Exactly. The study talks about how the Romantics often turned to the Middle Ages, not necessarily for historical accuracy, but as a source of creative inspiration. They were drawn to the mystery, the connection to nature, the spiritual depth, and the chivalrous ideals of that era.
It sounds like they created this romanticized version of the Middle Ages, this ideal world they could escape to in their minds.
That's a great way to put it. They weren't trying to recreate the Middle Ages as it really was. They were using those medieval themes and images to explore their own inner worlds, their own dreams and desires.
So they use the past as a canvas for their own emotional and imaginative explorations.
Exactly. The study also points out that this fascination with the past went beyond the Middle Ages. The Romantics also found inspiration in Greek mythology, the Near East, and other exotic locales.
So it's really about finding a sense of wonder and enchantment, whether in the distant past or in far-off lands.
Yes, that's a great way to summarize it. They were searching for a way to transcend the limitations of their own time and place, to connect with something bigger than themselves. And each writer found their own way to do that.
Let's talk about William Wordsworth's unique approach to nature. We've already touched on his love for the natural world, but what set his view apart from other romantics?
Wordsworth's connection to nature was incredibly personal and spiritual. While other romantics might have searched for escape in fantasy worlds or faraway places, Wordsworth found all the solace and inspiration he needed in the beauty of his surroundings, especially in the Lake District.
So he wasn't trying to escape from reality. He was finding a deeper reality within nature itself.
Exactly. He truly believed that nature held these profound truths, that it was a source of moral guidance, spiritual renewal, and creative inspiration. He saw nature as a teacher, a healer, and a reflection of the most fundamental truths about being human.
And that belief is so evident in his poem, Tintern Abbey, where he reflects on how transformative nature can be, right?
Absolutely. Tintern Abbey is this beautiful meditation on memory, time, and the enduring power of nature to shape our thoughts and feelings. Wordsworth revisits the Wye Valley after being away for 5 years and reflects on how his relationship with nature has changed over time.
It sounds like a deeply personal poem, almost like a spiritual autobiography.
It is. He remembers how excited he was when he first experienced the beauty of that landscape, how it filled him with awe and wonder. But he also acknowledges that his perception has changed. He doesn't see nature with the same youthful enthusiasm anymore. He's more mature now, more contemplative. He recognizes that nature can soothe the soul, inspire creativity, and connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
So it's not just about admiring a pretty view, it's about understanding the deep spiritual and emotional significance of our connection to nature.
That's it exactly. Wordsworth believed that by truly immersing ourselves in nature, by opening ourselves to its beauty and wisdom, we could reach this higher level of consciousness, a feeling of oneness with the universe, a deeper understanding of our place in it all.
That's a pretty powerful idea. It reminds me of the transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau, who were also heavily influenced by Wordsworth.
Definitely. Wordsworth's ideas about nature and the human spirit had a huge influence on American literature and philosophy. He shaped the way generations of writers and thinkers saw our relationship with nature.
Let's take a closer look at Wordsworth's life to understand where his creative inspiration came from, what shaped his worldview and his vision as an artist.
Wordsworth's life was full of ups and downs, joys and sorrows, love and loss. He had a blissful childhood exploring the Lake District, but he also lost his mother when he was very young.
Those early experiences, both good and bad, must have really shaped him.
They did. It's like the landscapes of his childhood were etched into his soul, becoming a source of comfort and inspiration throughout his life.
And his involvement with the French Revolution was a turning point too.
For sure. Like a lot of his contemporaries, Wordsworth was really excited about the French Revolution at first. He believed in the promise of liberty, equality, fraternity. He even went to France and fell in love with a French woman named Annette Vallon.
Whirlwind romance. What happened?
Well, sadly, the romance was cut short because of the war between France and England. Wordsworth had to return home, and his family, who disapproved of his revolutionary sympathies, cut him off financially.
Talk about tough times. He was heartbroken, broke, and disillusioned with the revolution he'd once believed in. What did he do then?
He turned to his one constant source of strength and inspiration, nature. He moved back to the Lake District with his sister Dorothy, who became his closest friend and confidant. It's around this time that he met Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and they formed a deep friendship that would influence both of their careers.
Romantic dream team.
Exactly. Together, they became this amazing creative force, inspiring and challenging each other. And in 1798, they published Lyrical Ballads, the collection that's seen as the beginning of the English Romantic movement.
That's a huge moment in literary history. What was so groundbreaking about Lyrical Ballads?
It was a complete departure from the traditional way of writing poetry. They embraced simple language, focused on the emotions and experiences of everyday people, and emphasized the imaginative power of poetry.
So they were making poetry accessible to everyone, not just the elite few.
Exactly. And that was a radical idea at the time. It was a major turning point in the way people thought about poetry.
Okay, so we've talked about Wordsworth's life and his big ideas, but let's get to the good stuff, the poems themselves. What are some of his most iconic works, the ones that best capture his essence?
Well, Lines Written in Early Spring is a great example of his ability to find joy in nature while also acknowledging the ways in which humans damage the natural world.
Classic Wordsworth. Appreciating the beauty of nature, but also lamenting our destructive tendencies.
Then there's The Tables Turned, where he basically tells his friend to put down the books and go experience nature firsthand.
Put down the phone, go for a walk. He was way ahead of his time.
He really was. He believed we could learn so much more from being in nature than from any book.
I love that. What else should we read?
London, 1802, is a powerful critique of English society. He's basically calling for a return to a simpler, more virtuous time.
That longing for the past is a classic romantic theme.
And finally, The World is Too Much with Us is a really powerful indictment of materialism and the spiritual emptiness of modern life. He'd rather be a pagan worshiping ancient gods than be caught up in the rat race.
That's a sentiment that still resonates today, don't you think?
Absolutely. Wordsworth's poetry reminds us to slow down, appreciate the simple things, and connect with something larger than ourselves.
I think you've given our listeners a wonderful introduction to Wordsworth's poetry. It's so full of timeless wisdom.
I agree. And while we've covered a lot today, there's always more to discover. I encourage everyone to explore his work and see what speaks to them.
And on that note, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into Romanticism. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll continue exploring John Keats, and we'll leave you with some final thoughts to ponder. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Romanticism. Last time we were talking about John Keats and how the critics just love to hate on him, especially those snooty Cockney School comments.
They really did. But despite all that negativity, Keats created some of the most beautiful and enduring poetry in the English language.
We were also talking about Keats's use of sensuousness in his poetry. Could you remind us what that means?
Of course. Sensuousness in Keats's poetry refers to his amazing ability to evoke vivid sensations through his words, making the reader feel like they're experiencing everything he's describing.
So it's not just about reading about a beautiful sunset. It's about feeling the warmth on your skin, smelling the salty air, hearing the waves crashing on the shore.
Exactly. Keats wanted his readers to experience the world through his poems, to taste the sweetness of a grape, feel the coolness of marble, smell the fragrance of a rose, all through his words.
That's incredible, to make language so powerful. How did he do that? What were some of his techniques?
Keats was a master of imagery and metaphor. He used very concrete sensory details to create these vivid pictures in the reader's mind. And he wasn't afraid to experiment with language, to invent new words, or to use old words in fresh ways.
So he was kind of a linguistic innovator, a poet who wasn't afraid to break the rules.
I'd say so. He had this amazing ability to capture the essence of an experience through words. And he didn't shy away from exploring difficult emotions either, like grief, longing, and the fear of death.
It's remarkable how he found so much beauty and meaning in the face of all that suffering. Losing his parents at a young age, struggling financially, battling tuberculosis. It's surprising that his poetry isn't just doom and gloom.
You're right. There's definitely a sense of sadness in his work and awareness of how fragile life is. But there's also this deep appreciation for beauty, a sense of wonder, and a joy in simply being alive.
He seems to be saying, life is tough, things don't always go our way, but even in the midst of suffering, there's beauty to be found. Moments of joy to be cherished.
I love that. And I think that's why people still connect with his poetry today. It speaks to something very fundamental about being human.
Okay, so we've talked about Keats's life, his style, his themes. What had his influence? What kind of mark did he leave on the literary world?
Even though he died so young, Keats's impact on poetry was huge. His focus on sensuous language, exploring complex emotions, and his innovative use of form, all of that paved the way for the modernist poets of the 20th century.
So he was this bridge between Romanticism and modernism.
Exactly. He took those core romantic ideas about expressing your emotions and made them even richer, more layered, and more experimental.
That's an incredible legacy. Imagine what he might have accomplished if he'd lived a longer life.
It's hard not to wonder, isn't it? But even in his short time, he created this amazing body of work that continues to inspire and challenge us.
Well said. Okay, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned about Romanticism.
We defined it as this reaction against the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and order. Instead, the Romantics embraced things like emotion, intuition, imagination, and a deep connection with nature. We talked about how the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau influenced them, and we talked about how they dealt with all the political and social changes happening around them, especially the French Revolution.
We saw how some of them, like Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey, became disillusioned with the revolution and turned towards more conservative ideas, while others, like Hazlitt, Byron, and Shelley, stayed true to their revolutionary beliefs and fought for radical change.
We also talked about how the Romantics looked to the past for inspiration and escape, especially the Middle Ages. They used elements of history, mythology, and folklore to fire up their imaginations and create these beautiful new worlds.
And we dove into the unique contributions of two really important Romantic poets, William Wordsworth and John Keats. We saw how Wordsworth found comfort and inspiration in nature, exploring themes of memory and the human search for meaning. And we saw how Keats used incredibly vivid language and imagery to create a world of intense beauty and emotion.
We also discussed the pushback they got from the conservative literary establishment. Those critics saw them as a threat, both artistically and ideologically. But even with all that opposition, the Romantics left a legacy that continues to shape us today.
I think we've given our listeners a great overview of Romanticism and its impact on literature, art, and culture. It's been an amazing journey.
I agree. Exploring this complex and multifaceted movement has been so rewarding.
But before we go, we want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked about how the Romantics looked for escape in nature, in the past, in their imaginations. How do you find escape from the pressures of our modern world? Where do you find beauty? Where do you find inspiration?
How do you connect with something larger than yourself when the world can feel so fragmented and overwhelming?
Think about our love for nature documentaries, our obsession with fantasy and science fiction, our constant search for authenticity and connection in this digital age. Do you see echoes of Romanticism there?
These are important questions to consider as we navigate our own complex world. And maybe, by revisiting the Romantics, we can find new ways of seeing, feeling, and understanding the world around us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Romanticism. We hope you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating era with us, and we hope you'll continue to seek out beauty, meaning, and inspiration wherever you can find it.